It was a beautiful Saturday morning in Lagos, Nigeria. The sun shone brightly as Joy and David exchanged vows in a lovely garden wedding. The atmosphere was filled with happiness and laughter as their families and friends gathered around to celebrate the union. Joy, a stunning bride in her white lace gown, beamed with happiness. Her smile lit up the entire garden, and her happiness was contagious. David, dashing in his well-tailored suit, smiled lovingly at his bride. Their families and friends couldn't help but notice the love that radiated between the couple. But amidst the laughter and cheers, one face stood out, Mrs. Johnson, David's mother. Her expression was cold, her eyes narrowed. She didn't approve of Joy. "Joy is not good enough for my son," Mrs. Johnson disclosed to her sister, Auntie Sarah, as they stood in the front row. "She's from a poor family. She'll bring shame to our family." Auntie Sarah tried to reassure Mrs. Johnson, but she wouldn't listen. "David deserves better," Mrs. Johnson continued. "Joy doesn't have the same social status as us. She's not worthy of our family's name." Auntie Sarah sighed, frustrated with her sister's stubbornness. "But sister, Joy is a good person," she said gently. "She loves David truly." Mrs. Johnson's face hardened. "Love isn't enough," she snapped. "Joy needs to prove herself worthy of our family." Auntie Sarah shook her head. "Sister, you're being unfair," she said. "Joy is a wonderful woman. Give her a chance." Mrs. Johnson's expression didn't change. After the wedding, Joy moved into the Johnsons' family home. Mrs. Johnson made it clear she wasn't welcome. Joy tried to win Mrs. Johnson over, cooking delicious meals and helping with household chores. But no matter what she did, Mrs. Johnson always found fault. "Your cooking is terrible," Mrs. Johnson would say. "You're lazy." David tried to intervene and make his mother accept Joy, but she wouldn't listen. "Mama, please," David would say. "Joy is trying her best." But it fell on deaf ear. "Joy needs to learn our family's ways," Mrs. Johnson would say. "She's not good enough for us." Joy began to feel like she was walking on eggshells. She never knew when Mrs. Johnson would lash out at her. One day, she mistakenly spilled coffee on the living room carpet. Mrs. Johnson exploded. "You careless!" she shouted. "You'll never be good enough for this family." Joy broke down in tears. David found her crying in their bedroom. "Mama doesn't mean it," David said, holding Joy close. "She's just stressed." Joy sniffed. "But David, I try so hard," she said. "I want to make her happy." David smiled. "You make me happy," he said. "That's all that matters." One day, Mrs. Johnson visited a native doctor, Barber, in a remote village. "Barber, I want Joy to be barren," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice dripping with malice. "She's not worthy of my son." Barber's eyes gleamed with understanding. "I'll help you," he said. "But it will cost you." Mrs. Johnson agreed, eager to ruin Joy's life. "The cost is 100,000 naira, Barber said. "And you must bring a personal item of Joy's." Mrs. Johnson hesitated but handed over the money and Joy's hair clip. Barber prepared a concoction, instructing Mrs. Johnson to pour it into Joy's drink. She collected the concoction, thanked Barber, and left. When Mrs. Johnson got home, she did as she was instructed. She sneakily poured the concoction into the wine Joy was about to take and left the kitchen. The next day, after taking the wine, Joy began to experience strange symptoms, constant fatigue, abdominal pain, and heavy bleeding. David rushed her to the hospital, and the doctor said she was food poisoned and it affected her womb. He conducted a surgery, gave her some prescriptions and told her she would be fine. "Joy, you're fine," the doctor said. "Just rest and eat well." But Joy knew something was wrong. "Someone must be behind this," she said to herself. Joy sensed something was amiss and she confided in her best friend, Mary. "Mary, I think it was Mrs. Johnson that was behind my illness. It seems like she wanted me to be barren," Joy said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't worry, we'll find out the truth," Mary consoled her. Mary encouraged her to investigate the matter and she left happily. Joy discovered the concoction in Mrs. Johnson's room, hidden in a small bag. She realized the truth: Mrs. Johnson had wanted her to be barren. Joy felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and betrayal. How could she do this to me? She thought with tears in her eyes. Why does she hate me so much? She confronted Mrs. Johnson, who denied everything. You're lying, Mrs. Johnson shouted. I would never harm you. But Joy knew the truth and she revealed it to David when he got home. David intervened, demanding the truth from his mother. Mama, tell me the truth, David said firmly. Mrs. Johnson broke down, confessing her evil deed. I didn't want Joy to have children, Mrs. Johnson sobbed. I wanted you to leave her. David was devastated. How could you, Mama? David asked, tears in his eyes. Mrs. Johnson's expression changed from sadness to defiance. I did it for our family's sake, Mrs. Johnson said. Joy is not worthy of us. David was torn between his love for Joy and his loyalty to his mother. He was disappointed in his mother for going to such an extent. He left his mother and went to the room where Joy was sobbing. Joy, I'm sorry, David said, holding her close. I had no idea. Joy forgave David but couldn't forgive Mrs. Johnson. I want to leave this house, she said. I can't live with her anymore. David agreed, and they moved out. Joy sought help from a traditional priest, who reversed the curse. Her health improved, and she became pregnant. David was overjoyed. We're having a baby, he exclaimed. Joy smiled. Our love conquered all, she said. Joy gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. David was present, holding her hand. Their son's birth brought them even closer together. We're a family now, David said, beaming. Joy nodded. Our love is unbreakable, she said. Mrs. Johnson realized her mistake and regretted her actions. She visited Joy and David, apologizing for her actions. I was blinded by pride, Mrs. Johnson said, tears in her eyes. Joy forgave Mrs. Johnson, but David struggled. Mama, you hurt us deeply, David said. Mrs. Johnson nodded. I know, son, she said. I promise to make amends. Mrs. Johnson worked hard to regain David's trust. She helped with childcare and supported Joy. Joy and Mrs. Johnson developed a tentative relationship. The past is behind us, Joy said. David smiled. Our family is healing, he said. Moral lesson. Joy learned that true love conquers all, even evil. David realized that family isn't just blood, it's love and support. Mrs. Johnson understood that pride and prejudice can destroy relationships. Their story spread, inspiring others to forgive and love unconditionally. Thanks for watching this inspiring video. Please do well to like and subscribe for more or the same.